The night my father called me a failure, he didn't whisper it. He didn't say it in anger either. He said it calmly, like he was stating a fact everyone already knew. "You'll never be anything," he told me, staring straight into my eyes across the dinner table. "Some people are just born to disappoint." And the worst part, everyone else at that table nodded. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been dismissed by the one person who was supposed to believe in you, then you know exactly what that moment does to your chest. It doesn't just hurt. It rewrites who you think you are. Before we go deeper into this story, if you believe that people who underestimate others always regret it in the end, make sure you subscribe and stay with me. I'm Kayla Bennett, and tonight's story is about a truth so powerful, it shattered a lifetime of cruelty. Because my father thought I was a failure, until the day he learned who I really was. And by then, it was far too late for him to fix what he'd broken. I grew up in a house where love had conditions. Not spoken conditions, not written rules, but you could feel them in the air like humidity before a storm. My father, Richard Hayes, believed in one thing above all else: achievement. Not happiness, not kindness. Achievement. He was a self-made businessman who built a regional construction empire from nothing. Everyone in town admired him. People shook his hand like they were touching greatness. But inside our house, he ruled like a judge who had already decided the verdict. And I was always guilty. My older brother, Daniel, was his golden child. Star athlete, straight-A student, confident, loud, everything my father respected. And then there was me. Quiet, bookish, introverted, always thinking more than speaking. From my earliest memories, I understood something without anyone explaining it. Daniel was the son he was proud of. I was the son he tolerated. I still remember being 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a drawing I'd spent hours on. It was a detailed sketch of our house. I had shaded every brick carefully. I was proud of it. I ran into the living room. "Dad, look what I made." He barely glanced up from his newspaper. "What is it?" "Our house." He stared for a second, then sighed. Why waste time drawing when you could be doing something useful? Daniel's outside practicing. That moment burned into me. Not because he yelled. Because he didn't care. That was the pattern of my childhood. Every achievement I had was invisible. Every mistake was magnified. When I got second place in a regional academic competition at age 12, I walked in hopping. Just once he'd be proud. He looked at the certificate and said, "So you weren't first. Not good job. Not I'm proud. Just disappointment." And over time, that disappointment started to live inside me. By high school, Daniel was a local celebrity, football captain, prom king. My father bragged about him to anyone who would listen. Meanwhile, I spent nights studying programming, engineering concepts, and business models. But none of that mattered to my father. Because it wasn't visible. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't something he could boast about at country club dinners. The real turning point came when I was 17. I told him I didn't want to join his construction company. I wanted to study software engineering. I'll never forget his reaction. He laughed. Not joking laughter. Cruel laughter. "Computers," he said. "You want to sit in a room all day typing?" "Yes," I replied quietly. "That's not a real career. That's hiding from the world." I felt something crack inside me. "I'm good at it," I said. He leaned forward, eyes cold. "You're not good at anything that matters." Silence filled the room. Then he said the sentence that would echo in my mind for years. "You're weak, son, and weak people fail." That night I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling until morning, feeling something heavy pressing on my chest. It wasn't just sadness. It was humiliation. Because part of me believed him. And that's the cruelest thing about constant criticism. Eventually, it doesn't sound like someone else's voice anymore. It sounds like your own. Still, I left for college anyway. Not with his support. Not with encouragement. Just with a single sentence he told me as I walked out the door. Don't expect me to pick you up when you fall. For years, that's exactly how I lived. I worked multiple jobs, studied relentlessly, built projects late into the night while my roommates slept. I lived off instant noodles and caffeine. And every time I struggled, I heard his voice. You'll never be anything. I never called home unless necessary, because every conversation ended the same way. How are your grades? Good. Still wasting time on computers? Yes. Let me know when you decide to do something real. Click. No, I miss you. No, take care. Just judgment. The final blow came during my final year of college. Daniel had joined the family business and was already being groomed as successor. At a family dinner, surrounded by relatives, my father raised a toast. To Daniel, he said proudly, the son who will carry my legacy. Everyone clapped. I sat there quietly. Then my father looked at me. And with a casual shrug, he added, and to my other son, well, we all know not everyone is built to succeed. Laughter. Polite, uncomfortable laughter. But laughter nonetheless. In that moment, I felt something inside me change. Not break. Not shatter. Harden. Because that night, for the first time in my life, I made a silent promise. I would never seek his approval again. I would never beg for his respect. And one day, he would learn exactly how wrong he had been. But he wouldn't learn it from me. He would learn it the hard way. And when that day came, I wouldn't be there to comfort him. I would be there to watch. And that day was closer than he ever imagined. The first time I truly understood what it meant to be alone was not when my father insulted me. It was the day I graduated. You know how people talk about graduation like it's this proud, shining milestone, families cheering, cameras flashing, parents hugging their kids with tears in their eyes. For everyone else, that's exactly what it was. For me, it was just another reminder. I scanned the crowd from the stage, hopping, stupidly hopping. Maybe he had changed his mind. Maybe he'd come. Maybe he'd finally see that I had finished something difficult. But there was no familiar face, no father, no brother, no one from home. Just empty rows where they should have been. Later, I checked my phone. One message from my father. Congratulations, let me know when you get a real job. No, I'm proud. No, I wish I could be there. Just that. I remember standing outside the campus building, diploma in my hand, watching other graduates take photos with their families. My chest felt tight. Not angry. Just hollow. Like there was a space inside me where something essential should have been. But wasn't. That night I sat alone in my small apartment, the walls thin enough to hear neighbors laughing. I kept rereading his message. And for the first time in years, I cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just silent tears that wouldn't stop. Because deep down, no matter how much I told myself I didn't care, I still wanted one thing. His approval. And I knew I would never get it. So I did what I had always done. I buried the pain under work. My first job was brutal, a junior developer position at a small startup that barely paid enough to cover rent. The hours were endless, the pressure constant. But for me, it felt like survival. Every line of code I wrote, every late night, every problem I solved was proof to myself that my father was wrong. But life didn't suddenly become easier. The company nearly collapsed twice. There were months when we didn't know if we'd get paid. I ate cheap instant meals. I wore the same worn jacket for years. Meanwhile, I occasionally heard news from home. Daniel was thriving. My father had promoted him quickly. He was being introduced everywhere as the future of Hayes Construction. Local newspapers featured photos of them shaking hands with politicians, smiling confidently. I would see those pictures online sometimes. And every time, I felt that old, familiar sting. Because I knew something no one else did. Daniel wasn't as capable as my father believed. He had confidence, yes. Charm, absolutely. But discipline, focus, responsibility, those things he lacked completely. Even as kids, he'd cut corners, cheat, lie when it was convenient. And my father never saw it. Or maybe he refused to. Years passed. Slowly, quietly, my life began to change. The startup I worked for built a software platform that unexpectedly took off. We landed a major contract. Then another. Suddenly, investors were interested. Within 3 years, I wasn't just an employee anymore. I was a partner. Within 5, I owned a significant share of a company valued in the millions. But no one back home knew. Because I never told them. Not out of revenge. At least not at first. At first it was fear. Fear that if I told my father, he'd still find a way to dismiss it. Say it wasn't real success. Say it didn't matter. I didn't want to feel that rejection again. So I stayed silent. I kept my life private. No flashy social media. No announcements. Just quiet progress. Until one day, everything shifted. I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. But something made me pick up. Hello. A familiar voice responded. Cold, controlled. My father. I need to talk to you. Those words alone made my stomach tighten. He never called just to talk. About what? I asked cautiously. There was a pause. Then he said something I had never heard in his voice before. Strain. The company is having difficulties. I sat up straight. What kind of difficulties? Another pause. Then, reluctantly, Daniel made some decisions that didn't work out. That was the first crack. The first hint that the golden sun wasn't perfect after all. Over the next few weeks, more details emerged. And they were worse than I imagined. Daniel had approved risky expansions, signed contracts without proper oversight, ignored financial warnings, and worse, he had trusted the wrong people. The company was drowning in debt. Legal problems were piling up. Suppliers were suing. Banks were tightening their grip. And for the first time in his life, my father was losing control. I could hear it in his voice every time he called. The sharp authority was gone, replaced by frustration and something close to panic. But here's what he never said. Not once. I was wrong about you. Not once did he apologize. Not once did he acknowledge the years of damage. Instead, during one call, he said something that made my hands shake. You work with computers, maybe you can help us organize our systems or something. Organize? Like I was still the kid with the drawing he barely glanced at. Like everything I had achieved was just a hobby. I felt heat rising in my chest. For a moment I couldn't speak. Then I simply said, I'll think about it. But that night, I didn't sleep. Because something had finally shifted inside me. All those years of humiliation. All those sleepless nights. All those moments of being treated like I was worthless. They didn't feel distant anymore. They felt alive. Burning. And for the first time, I wasn't thinking about earning his approval. I was thinking about something else. Justice. Because my father was about to learn a truth that would change everything he believed about me. But the way he would learn it would not be gentle, and it would not be kind. Because by then, I had stopped wanting his love. I only wanted him to understand exactly what he had destroyed, and exactly who he had underestimated, and the opportunity to show him was about to arrive. The night I realized the power had shifted, I was sitting alone in my apartment, staring at the city lights through the window. My father's voice kept replaying in my head. "You work with computers, maybe you can help organize our systems." Organize? That word echoed like an insult. After everything, after years of sacrifice, sleepless nights, relentless work, he still saw me as small, still saw me as lesser. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. And for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to feel something I had buried for years. Anger. Not explosive anger. Not the kind that shouts. Cold anger. The kind that sits quietly and plans. Because in that moment, I realized something crucial. My father didn't actually know who I had become. He didn't know about the company I co-founded. He didn't know I had helped build systems used by major corporations. He didn't know that investors trusted me with decisions worth millions. To him, I was still the quiet, disappointing son who hid behind a computer screen. And that ignorance was power. I could tell him the truth right then. I could reveal everything. Watch his shock. Watch his regret. But that would be too easy. Too quick. Too kind. Because the pain he had caused me hadn't been quick. It had stretched across decades. It had shaped my identity. It had lived inside my bones. No, if he was going to learn the truth, he would learn it in a way that forced him to feel everything I had felt. Helplessness, powerlessness, regret. That night I opened my laptop and began researching Hayes Construction. Not as a son, as an analyst, as a strategist. And what I discovered was worse than I expected. Their financials were a mess. Debt ratios were dangerously high. Cash flow was unstable. Projects were delayed. Legal disputes were stacking up. But the biggest issue wasn't the numbers. It was leadership. Daniel, he had taken risks my father never would have. Expansions into unfamiliar markets. Contracts with unstable partners. Loans with brutal interest terms. And worst of all, he had hidden many of these problems. Trying to protect his reputation. Trying to avoid disappointing my father. Ironically, he had done exactly what I spent my life doing. Pretending to be okay while quietly drowning. Except his decisions weren't just hurting himself. They were threatening an entire company. Hundreds of employees. Families who depended on those paychecks. And that's when something inside me shifted again. Because this wasn't just personal anymore. This was bigger. If the company collapsed, innocent people would suffer. Workers who had done nothing wrong. Families who relied on that income. I couldn't let that happen. But I also couldn't let my father escape accountability. I needed a solution that did both. Saved the people. Exposed the truth. And forced him to confront reality. Slowly, carefully, an idea began forming. Not revenge through destruction. Revenge through revelation. I would save his company. But I would do it in a way that made him realize I was the one holding all the power. And he had spent his life treating me like I had none. Over the next several weeks I built a plan. I studied their contracts. Mapped their debts. Identified which assets could be restructured. Which projects could be salvaged. Which liabilities could be renegotiated. It was complex, but solvable. There was just one catch. They couldn't fix it alone. They needed outside capital, significant capital. And that's where I came in. Through my company and investment partners, I had access to resources they desperately needed. Enough to stabilize everything. Enough to save hundreds of jobs. But if I stepped in, it wouldn't be as their desperate son. It would be as something else entirely. An investor. A decision maker. A man they would have to respect. The thought sent a strange chill through my body. Not excitement. Not joy. Something heavier. Like standing at the edge of a moment that would change everything forever. I knew once this happened, my relationship with my father would never be the same. There would be no going back. No pretending. Only truth. Weeks later, I received another call. This time my father's voice sounded older. Worn down. We may have to sell the company, he admitted quietly. Hearing those words shook me more than I expected. Because Hayes Construction wasn't just a business to him. It was his identity. His life's work. The proof that he had risen from nothing. And now, it was slipping through his fingers. For a brief moment, a small part of me felt something unexpected. Pity. But then I remembered the dinner table. The laughter. The word failure. And that feeling hardened again. He asked if I could come home. Just to talk, he said. I agreed. Not as a son seeking approval, but as a man ready to change the balance of power forever. The drive back to my hometown felt surreal. The same streets, the same buildings, the same memories pressing against my mind like ghosts. When I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, my hands tightened on the steering wheel. I could feel my heart beating heavily in my chest. Not from fear, from anticipation, because I knew what was about to happen. Inside that house, my father still believed he was the one in control. He still believed I was the weak one, the failure. But in just a few days, he was going to learn the truth. And when he did, it wouldn't just shock him. It would shatter everything he thought he knew about me, and everything he believed about himself. Because the next time we met, he wouldn't be talking to his disappointing son. He would be facing the only person who could save his entire world. And he would have no choice but to listen. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into my childhood home was the silence. It felt different from the silence I remembered growing up. Back then it was heavy with judgment. Now, it was heavy with fear. The house looked the same polished floors, same framed awards on the walls, same expensive furniture my father once treated like proof of his success. But something had changed. The air itself felt tense, like a storm had already passed and left everything fragile behind. My father was sitting in the living room when I entered. For the first time in my life, he didn't look imposing. He looked tired, older than I remembered. His shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes dull with stress. For a brief second my chest tightened, not with anger, with the strange realization that time had finally touched him too. But then he spoke, and the old pattern returned instantly. You look well, he said, his tone neutral, almost formal. Not warm, not emotional, just controlled. I nodded, so do you. It wasn't true. But I didn't say it to comfort him. I said it to maintain distance. He gestured for me to sit. Daniel was already there. And the moment I saw him, I understood everything. He didn't look confident anymore. His usual arrogance was gone. In its place was something raw. Shame. He couldn't even meet my eyes. That alone told me how deep the damage ran. My father began explaining the situation. Numbers, debt, lawsuits, contract failures. He spoke like a man trying to stay composed while standing on the edge of a cliff. Finally, after nearly an hour, he exhaled slowly and said the words he clearly hated admitting. "We need outside investors." There it was. The moment. I felt my heartbeat slow, steady, controlled. Because this was the exact moment I had been preparing for. I leaned back slightly and asked calmly, "What kind of investment are you looking for?" He hesitated, then said quietly, "Enough to save the company." I nodded once, then reached into my briefcase, pulled out a folder, and placed it on the table between us. "This might help," I said. He frowned slightly, opened the folder, and began reading. At first his expression was confused, then focused, then shocked. I watched the exact moment realization hit him. His eyes widened, his hands froze, his breathing slowed, because what he was reading was a full restructuring proposal, detailed, precise, professional, signed by an investment group. My investment group. At the bottom of the document, under primary stakeholder representative, was my name. He looked up at me slowly, and in that moment, for the first time in my entire life, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Not authority, not disappointment, not indifference, respect, mixed with disbelief. "You did this?" he asked quietly. I held his gaze. "Yes." Silence filled the room. Thick, heavy. Daniel stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time in his life. My father flipped through the pages again, almost as if he couldn't believe they were real. This would stabilize everything," he whispered. "Yes," I replied calmly. His voice trembled slightly. "You're telling me you have the power to save this company." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile. I just said the words slowly. I always did. The room went completely still. And then, he asked the question that had lived between us for decades. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" That was the moment everything I had carried for years rose to the surface. Not explosively. Not emotionally. Just clearly. Because I wasn't speaking as a hurt son anymore. I was speaking as a man. "I tried," I said quietly. "My entire life I tried to show you who I was, but you never looked." His face tightened. "You never wanted to see anything that didn't fit your idea of success," I continued. "You didn't want to see my strengths, you only saw what I was." He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. So I kept going. "You called me weak, you called me a failure, you laughed at my dreams, you dismissed everything I cared about." My voice didn't shake. Because I wasn't angry anymore. I was just telling the truth. "And now," I said softly, "the thing you thought made me worthless is the only thing that can save you." My father lowered his head. And for the first time in my life, I saw him completely powerless. Not physically, emotionally. He whispered something I never expected to hear. I was wrong. The words were quiet, but they carried decades of weight. He swallowed hard. I was blind. I thought success looked only one way. I thought strength looked only one way. His eyes met mine again, filled with regret. "I hurt you." Those 3 words hit harder than anything he had ever said before, because they were real. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked the final question. "What do you want in return?" That was the moment of truth. The moment where revenge could have been cruel. But real justice isn't about destruction. It's about accountability. I answered calmly. "I want the company restructured with ethical oversight. I want the workers protected. I want transparency." He nodded quickly. "And personally?" he asked. I looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "I don't want revenge." A flicker of relief crossed his face. But then I added, "I just want you to live the rest of your life knowing you spent decades underestimating the person who would ultimately save everything you built." That truth hit him harder than any punishment ever could. Because he knew it was permanent. There was no undoing the past. No erasing the years of damage. Only living with the reality of what he had done. The investment went through. The company stabilized. Workers kept their jobs. The lawsuits were resolved. And for the first time in decades, Hayes Construction survived not because of my father's strength, but because of mine. Our relationship changed after that. He never spoke to me with contempt again. He never dismissed my work again. But something else changed too. I stopped needing his approval. Because by the time he finally saw my worth, I had already learned to see it myself. And that was the real victory. Some people think revenge is about making someone suffer. But the most powerful form of justice isn't pain. It's truth. It's watching someone confront the reality they spent years denying. My father didn't lose his company. He didn't lose his life's work. He lost something far more important. The illusion that he had always been right. And that's a loss that stays with a person forever. Because now, every success that company has is a reminder of the son he once called a failure, and the truth he almost never learned. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or made to feel like you weren't enough, remember this. Someone else's opinion does not define your future. Sometimes the people who doubt you the most are the ones who will one day stand in shock at what you become. I'm Kayla Bennett. And if you believe the quiet ones often carry the greatest strength, make sure to subscribe and stay for the next story. Because the best justice stories are always the ones where truth wins in the end.